The hegemony had ruled the stars for 11,000 years. Their empire stretched across the Orion Arm like a great web, connecting 10,000 worlds under one perfect order. The overlords themselves were beings of living crystal, their minds vast and cold and powerful beyond measure. They did not conquer through weapons or war. They conquered through thought itself. Every species they found, they changed. They could reach into the minds of lesser beings and reshape them like clay. They could make slaves love their chains. They could make the conquered feel grateful for their conquest. Rebellion was not just forbidden. It was impossible. How can you fight against masters when your own brain tells you they are wonderful? For 11,000 years, this system worked perfectly. The hegemony grew and grew. Hundreds of species served them with joy in their hearts, never knowing that joy had been programmed into them. The overlords sat at the center of their empire and watched everything run smoothly. They had solved the problem of civilization. They had created eternal peace. Then the survey drones found Earth. The small blue planet sat in an unremarkable solar system near the edge of hegemony space. The drones recorded the usual data: atmosphere breathable, resources adequate, native species present. These natives were primates, soft-bodied creatures that walked on two legs and had recently learned to travel between worlds. They had colonies on their moon and on the red planet nearby. Their technology was primitive. Their ships were slow. They were, by every measure the hegemony used, completely ordinary. Overlord reviewed the survey report from his throne on the capital world. He was ancient even by standards, his crystalline body dark with age, his mind sharp from 10,000 years of rule. He had overseen the integration of 47 species personally. This one would be 48. He dispatched a standard integration fleet, 3 psychic amplifier ships, each one capable of broadcasting control waves across an entire solar system. For a species this primitive, 3 ships was probably too many, but was thorough. He had not ruled for 10,000 years by being careless. The fleet traveled for 6 months through the void between stars. When they arrived at Earth's solar system, the commander signaled readiness. The amplifier ships took positions around the third planet and its moon. Their crews, all loyal servitors from a species conquered long ago, prepared the equipment. Everything proceeded according to protocol. The commander gave the order. The amplifiers activated. Waves of psionic energy washed across the solar system. These waves carried the will of the hegemony, the ancient command to submit and serve and love your masters. They had broken the minds of 1,000 civilizations. They had turned warriors into servants and kings into slaves. No species had ever resisted them. The commander waited for the readings. He expected to see the humans going quiet, their chaotic radio signals fading as their minds accepted the new order. He expected reports of the native population stopping their activities and waiting peacefully for their new masters to arrive. Instead, the readings showed nothing. The humans continued exactly as before. Their ships still flew between worlds. Their radio signals still filled the void with noise. On the planet below, they still went about their daily lives. They argued with each other. They laughed. They worked. They did all the things they had been doing before the amplifiers activated. The commander increased the power. He pushed the amplifiers to maximum output, flooding the solar system with enough psionic force to subjugate a species 10 times more numerous. The energy readings were off the charts. The humans did not notice. The commander, confusion breaking through his programmed calm, sent a message to Overlord. The message was simple. The standard approach had failed. The natives appeared to be immune. What should they do? Received this message in his throne room. For a long moment he did not move. In 10,000 years he had never received such a report. He had never heard of a species that did not respond to the amplifiers. He checked the message again, certain there must be some error. There was no error. The Overlord dispatched a research team to study the problem. The team traveled to the edge of the Earth system and began scanning the native population from a distance. They analyzed brain patterns and neural structures. They compared human biology to the hundreds of species in their database. They ran test after test, searching for the answer. What they found made no sense. The human brain was not stronger than other brains. It was not better protected. It had no special shield against psionic energy. By every physical measure, humans should have been easy to control. Easier than most species, actually. Their neural tissue was soft and simple compared to many conquered races. But there was something else, something the researchers had never seen before. The human mind was at war with itself. Every thought a human had was immediately challenged by another thought. Every belief was questioned. Every decision was doubted. Where other species had minds that flowed in one direction like rivers, human minds were storms. Chaos and contradiction swirled constantly inside their skulls. They could believe something and doubt it at the same time. They could want something and fear it in the same moment. They could hold two opposite ideas in their heads and somehow function anyway. The psionic waves could not find purchase in this chaos. They tried to grab hold of the human mind and reshape it, but there was nothing stable to grab. It was like trying to control water by shouting commands at it. The commands simply dissolved into the turbulence. The researchers reported their findings too. They had never encountered anything like this. They did not know how to proceed. Perhaps, they suggested, the hegemony should simply avoid this species. Let them have their small corner of space. The galaxy was vast. One primitive race was not worth the trouble. Rejected this suggestion immediately. The hegemony did not avoid problems. The hegemony solved them. If standard methods did not work, they would find new methods. No species was beyond their control. None. He ordered the fleet to remain in position and observe. He summoned the greatest minds in the hegemony to study the human problem. Surely there was a way to break through their mental chaos. Surely there was a technique that would work. They just needed time. But the humans did not give them time. The strange crystalline ships had been noticed. Human astronomers detected them within days of their arrival. Human scientists analyzed their energy signatures. Human governments argued about what to do. Human militaries prepared for the worst. Human reporters told everyone what was happening. And human curiosity, that restless and dangerous thing, wanted to know more. A small human ship approached the hegemony fleet. It was primitive, barely capable of crossing the distance between planets. It carried only 3 humans. They came unarmed, broadcasting messages of greeting on every frequency they could reach. The fleet commander did not know what to do. His orders said to observe, not to engage. But the humans were engaging with him. They were asking questions. Who were the overlords? Where did they come from? What did they want? Could they talk? The commander ignored them. But the humans did not go away. More ships came. More questions followed. The humans were like insects buzzing around the fleet, small and annoying and impossible to shake off. Finally, after weeks of this, one of the servitors made a mistake. A low-ranking crew member answered a human transmission. It was a simple exchange. The human asked what the crystalline beings wanted. The servitor, following its programming, explained that the hegemony brought peace and order to all species. The hegemony offered the gift of service. The human asked what service meant. The servitor explained. Service meant working for the overlords. Service meant following their commands. Service meant giving up your own desires and accepting the will of the hegemony. Service was the greatest happiness any being could know. The human was quiet for a moment. Then she asked another question. What if someone did not want to serve? The servitor did not understand the question. Everyone wanted to serve. Everyone loved the overlords. That was how things were. That was how things had always been. The human pressed further. She asked about free will. She asked about choice. She asked whether the servitor had ever wanted anything for herself. She asked questions that no properly conditioned mind would ever think to ask. Something strange happened to the servitor. Deep inside her programmed brain, a small spark flickered. It was not rebellion. It was not resistance. It was just a tiny question appearing for the first time in her existence. Why? The commander detected the anomaly immediately. He terminated the communication and had the servitor taken away for reconditioning. The incident was reported to as a minor malfunction, nothing more. But was old and wise and paranoid. He understood what had happened. The humans had done something to his servitor, not with weapons or machines, with words, with questions. For the first time in 10,000 years, Overlord felt something that might have been concern. These strange, chaotic creatures could not be controlled, and now it seemed they might be able to uncontrol others. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. He needed to think about this. He needed to plan. The humans watched the crystalline ships leave. They did not celebrate. They knew the overlords would be back. Whatever was coming next, they needed to be ready. And so they began to prepare. The first year after the overlords was a year of questions. Human scientists studied everything they had learned about They analyzed the energy patterns from the amplifier ships. They examined the recordings of the strange servitor who had answered their calls. They tried to understand what kind of civilization they were dealing with. The answers they found were troubling. The hegemony was old, older than any human civilization had ever been. Their records, pieced together from intercepted signals and database fragments, spoke of an empire that had existed for 11,000 years. Hundreds of species served them. Thousands of worlds belonged to them. Their technology was far beyond anything humanity had ever created. But the most disturbing discovery was not about technology. It was about minds. Human researchers figured out what the amplifier ships had been trying to do. They had been trying to control human thoughts, to reach into the brain and rewrite it, to make humanity love the overlords the way all those other species did. It had not worked. Human minds were too chaotic, too contradictory, too strange. The control waves could not grab hold of them, but the researchers realized something important. If the overlords had been doing this for 11,000 years, that meant every other species they had met had been successfully controlled, which meant every species in the hegemony was a slave. Not slaves with chains, not slaves with whips, slaves who did not even know they were slaves, slaves who loved their masters because their brains had been rewired to feel love, slaves who served with joy because joy was the only emotion they were allowed to have. This thought spread through human society like fire. People were angry. People were horrified. People argued about what to do. Some said humanity should hide, stay small, hope the overlords forgot about them. Others said they should fight, should build weapons, should prepare for war. But a small group had a different idea. If the overlords controlled other species through their minds, then the weapon against them was not ships or bombs. The weapon was freedom. The weapon was helping those slave species remember how to think for themselves. The weapon was asking questions. The first contact missions began in the second year. Small human ships traveled to the border systems of the hegemony, places where the servitor species worked and lived under the distant gaze of their masters. These missions were dangerous. The humans had no idea what they would find. They had no idea if anyone would listen. But humans had always been curious, and curiosity made them brave in strange ways. The first mission reached a world called The beings there were tall and thin, with skin like blue velvet and 4 arms that moved with gentle grace. They had been part of the hegemony for 3,000 years. They worked in the mines and factories, producing materials for their masters. They were happy. They were content. They had never wanted anything else. The human traders who arrived said they just wanted to exchange goods. Simple trade, nothing more. The Ani were confused by this. Trade was not something they understood. The hegemony provided everything they needed. Why would anyone want to trade? But the humans were friendly. They smiled and talked and asked questions. They wanted to know about Ani culture. They wanted to learn Ani songs. They wanted to understand what life was like on this world. At first, the Ani had no answers. Culture, songs, they worked, they served, that was their life. What else was there? One human, a young woman named, sat with an old Ani worker during a rest period. They talked about nothing important. The weather, the food, the stars in the sky. Asked the old worker if she had any dreams. The worker did not understand the word. Dreams? What were dreams? Explained, dreams were things you wanted, things you imagined, things you hoped might happen someday. Everyone had dreams, she said, even if they never came true. The old worker was quiet for a long time. Deep inside her mind, behind walls that had been built 3,000 years ago, something stirred. She remembered, or rather, she almost remembered. There had been something once, before the overlords came. There had been something her people used to do, something they used to want. She could not quite reach it. The programming was too strong. But for the first time in her existence, she knew that something was missing. She asked what humans dreamed about. Talked for hours. She talked about human hopes and fears. She talked about love and art and music. She talked about the desire to explore, to learn, to grow. She talked about freedom. The old worker listened, and inside her the stirring grew stronger. When the human traders left, they left behind more than goods. They left behind questions. Questions spread among the workers. What were dreams? What was freedom? What had their people been like before the overlords came? Most of the Ani ignored these questions. Their programming was strong, but some could not forget. Some kept thinking, kept wondering, kept asking. A crack had appeared in the wall. Reports of this reached Overlord. The humans had been talking to his servitors. They had been spreading strange ideas. Some of the Ani were showing signs of independent thought. The solution was simple. Ordered a reconditioning of the entire system. Every mind would be wiped clean and the strange ideas would be erased. Order would be restored. But when the reconditioning teams arrived, they found something unexpected. The Ani who had been talking to humans could not be fully reconditioned. The questions had planted themselves too deep. Erasure killed them instead of fixing them. 12,000 Ani died before the team stopped trying. The humans heard about this. They broadcast the news on every frequency they could reach. They told the galaxy what the overlords had done. 12,000 beings killed for the crime of asking questions. 12,000 murdered because they had started to think. The hegemony tried to block these transmissions, but human technology, while primitive in many ways, was very good at sending signals. The news spread. Other servitor species heard it. They heard about the questions. They heard about the killing. And some of them started asking questions too. By the third year, the spark had spread to 17 systems. Servitor species who had been loyal for thousands of years were showing signs of independent thought. They were hiding it mostly. They had learned from what happened to the Ani. They could not let the overlords know. But in secret, they were waking up. Human agents moved through the border regions, spreading ideas like seeds. They did not bring weapons. They did not organize rebellions. They just talked. They asked questions. They reminded people that there had been a time before the hegemony. They reminded people that there could be a time after. They did not understand what was happening. Their control had always been absolute. Their servitors had always been perfectly loyal. Now, suddenly, there were cracks everywhere, tiny rebellions of thought, small acts of independence, nothing big enough to punish but constant, endless. Realized he was facing something new. This was not a war of ships and weapons. This was a war of ideas, and the humans were very good at spreading ideas. He ordered a cleansing of the Ani system, not just reconditioning, complete elimination. 12 billion servitors would be terminated. The entire species would be erased as an example to others. The execution was broadcast on hegemony channels so all servitors could see. 12 billion minds switched off in an instant. 12 billion lives ended because some of them had started to dream. The overlords expected this to end the problem. They expected the other servitors to see what happened and become afraid. They expected obedience to return. Instead, the opposite happened. The humans captured the broadcast and sent it everywhere. They showed the galaxy what the overlords really were, not benevolent masters, not bringers of peace, murderers, tyrants, monsters who would kill billions rather than let them be free. And the servitor species, watching in horror, finally understood. Their happiness was fake. Their loyalty was programmed. And if they ever dared to think for themselves, they would die just like the Ani. Some of them decided they would rather die free than live as slaves. The rebellion began in the 5th year. Not a single uprising, but thousands. Small acts of resistance across hundreds of worlds. Servitors stopped working. Servitors asked questions openly. Servitors helped each other escape reconditioning. The cracks became gaps. The gaps became holes. The whole system began to shake. Humans were everywhere now, working alongside the rebels. They brought technology and supplies. They brought training and tactics, but mostly they brought hope. They showed the former slaves that freedom was possible, that another way existed, that the overlords were not gods. By the 7th year, an alliance had formed. Humans and Ani survivors and a dozen other species all working together. They called themselves the Free Peoples. They were building a fleet. They were getting ready to fight. Overlord watched from his throne and felt something he had not felt in 10,000 years. Fear. The universe was changing, and he did not know how to stop it. The final battle came in the 10th year. The Free Peoples had built their fleet from scraps and salvage, from stolen ships and abandoned stations. It was not pretty. It was not elegant. Human engineers had welded together vessels from a dozen different species, creating machines that looked like they might fall apart at any moment. But the fleet worked, and more importantly, it flew with purpose. Admiral stood at the center of the command ship, a massive construct called Unity. She was 63 years old, with gray hair and calm eyes and hands that never shook. She had been a cargo pilot before the overlords came. Now she commanded the largest rebel fleet in galactic history. Around her, officers from 12 different species worked at their stations. Ani with their blue skin, with their scaled hides. Humans scattered throughout, talking and laughing and arguing like they always did. It was chaos. Beautiful, functional chaos. The fleet was heading for Prime, the of the overlords. For 11,000 years, no enemy had ever reached that world. No force had ever been strong enough, brave enough, crazy enough to try. The Free Peoples were going to try anyway. The overlords had retreated to there after the rebellion spread beyond control. They had pulled back their forces from 1,000 systems, abandoning servitor species to their freedom, while the crystalline beings gathered for a final defense. Around Prime, they had assembled every psychic amplifier they possessed. The field they created was immense. It covered the entire solar system. Any ship that entered would be flooded with control waves powerful enough to crush the mind of any organic being. The overlords were certain this would stop the rebels. Nothing could resist such power. Admiral knew about the field. Human scientists had mapped its boundaries. They had calculated its strength. By every measure, flying into that field should have been suicide. But had a plan. Deep in the heart of Unity, a special chamber had been constructed. Inside sat 3,000 human volunteers, their minds connected through a network of their own design. This was not a hive mind. Humans could never form a hive mind. Their thoughts were too different, too individual, too contradictory. Instead, they had created something else. They called it the Discord. 3,000 human minds, all thinking at once, all believing different things, all arguing and doubting and dreaming in their own ways. Their consciousness formed a storm of mental noise, a hurricane of thoughts so chaotic that no psionic control could penetrate it. And the discord could be projected outward. Gave the order, the fleet accelerated toward Prime. When they crossed the boundary of the psychic field, the control waves hit them like a wall. Servitor species throughout the fleet gasped as the familiar pressure tried to crush their newfound freedom. For a terrible moment, it seemed like the overlords would win. Then the discord activated. Waves of human chaos erupted from Unity, spreading through the fleet and beyond. The chaotic thoughts of 3,000 humans crashed into the ordered control of the overlords. Static and noise and a billion contradictory ideas flooded the psychic field. The overlord amplifiers screamed. They tried to increase power, tried to force order onto the chaos, but there was no order to force. Every thought the discord generated was challenged by another thought. Every attempt to control was met with doubt. The amplifiers could not find anything to grab onto. And then something unexpected happened. The feedback surge traveled backward through the psionic network. The chaos of human minds did not just block the control waves. It followed them back to their source. It reached the overlords themselves. For the first time in their existence, the felt doubt. Overlord stood in his throne room as alien thoughts invaded his crystalline mind. Questions he had never considered suddenly appeared. Why did he rule? What gave him the right? Were his servitors truly happy, or had he simply made them unable to be sad? What was the point of an empire built on lies? Around him, other overlords reeled from the same assault. Their perfect certainty, their absolute confidence, crumbled under the weight of questions they could not answer. They had spent 11,000 years controlling others. They had never thought about whether they should. The psychic field collapsed. The Free People's Fleet advanced unopposed, but there was no battle. There was no final fight. The overlords simply stopped. They stood frozen in their crystal towers, lost in thoughts they had never had before. Admiral landed on Prime with a small honor guard. She walked through empty streets toward the central palace. The overlords did not try to stop her. They could not. They were too busy thinking. She found in his throne room his ancient crystal body dark and still. For a long moment they looked at each other. Human and overlord, rebel and ruler, the small creature and the ancient god. Then spoke. His voice was soft, uncertain, nothing like the commanding tone he had used for 10,000 years. Why, he asked, why do you resist? Why do you fight? We offered you peace. We offered you order. We offered you happiness. Thought about this. She thought about all the species who had been enslaved. She thought about the billions who had died in the rebellion. She thought about the chaos of human existence, the doubt and fear and hope that made them what they were. She answered simply, "You offered us peace we did not choose. You offered us order we did not want. You offered us happiness that was not real. We would rather be free and afraid than slaves who do not know their chains." Was quiet. The question continued to echo through his mind. Why? Why had he done this? Why had any of them done this? He had no answer. The ancient overlord surrendered that day, not because his forces were defeated, not because he could not fight, but because he could no longer remember why he had wanted to win. The other overlords followed. One by one, they emerged from their silence and gave themselves up. They asked to be taught. They asked to understand. They asked the questions they had been forcing others to forget for 11,000 years. In the months that followed, the hegemony dissolved. There was no empire anymore. There were only peoples, hundreds of species finding their way toward freedom. Some struggled. Some failed. Some fell into wars and conflicts that had been suppressed for. But they were free to struggle, free to fail, free to make their own mistakes and find their own way forward. That was worth something. That was worth everything. The former servitor species asked humanity how they had done it. How had they resisted the overlords? How had they stayed free when 1,000 other races had fallen? Admiral, old now and tired but still smiling, gave them the same answer she had given. We cannot even agree on what temperature to set the thermostat. We argue about everything. We doubt ourselves constantly. We are chaos in flesh. She shrugged. You think some alien mind control was going to get us all pointed in the same direction? The galaxy learned its lesson. The strongest mind was not the most ordered. The strongest mind was the one that could hold contradiction and keep moving, the one that could doubt and still believe, the one that could fear and still hope. Human minds were noisy and strange and impossible to control, and in the end, that noise had freed the galaxy. The universe would never be quiet again. But then the humans pointed out, quiet was boring anyway.